There was one aisle in that store where every box on the shelf was taller than you were. And the reason that store no longer exists is not a feeling. It is a document. You remember the floor. Concrete, polished in some stores, scuffed in others. The carts were oversized and they rattled because the wheels were too small. The fluorescent lights ran in long, unbroken rows that made the building feel like it stretched on forever. The bikes hung from the ceiling on metal hooks, dozens of them, in colors you had already decided on before you walked through the door. Board games were stacked 3 deep on shelves that ran the full length of the aisle. And somewhere near the back, past the action figures still sealed in blister packs, there was a glass display case with the expensive remote control cars, the ones with real rubber tires and working headlights. You were not allowed to touch them. You touched them anyway. That was Toys R Us. And if you are old enough to remember standing in that aisle, looking up at a wall of boxes that seemed to go all the way to the ceiling, you already know what happened to Toys R Us. The stores closed. The giraffe disappeared. 33,000 people lost their jobs in a single quarter. But here is the number that almost nobody outside of a bankruptcy courtroom has ever heard. $7.5 billion. That is not what the company was worth. That is the total debt obligation loaded onto it by the 3 financial firms that bought it. Not by a competitor, not by the market, not by Amazon, by the buyers. And the company was still generating $11.6 billion in annual revenue the year they signed that contract. In the next 30 minutes, 3 things. First, how 3 financial firms used the company's own balance sheet to purchase itself, and why that debt guaranteed the toy aisles would never be renovated again. Second, how much money left the building in fees and dividends while families were still shopping inside. And third, why liquidating 800 stores was more profitable for the owners than saving a single one. A man named Charles Lazarus came home from the Second World War in 1945. His father ran a bicycle repair shop in Washington, D.C. Within 3 years, Lazarus had converted part of that shop into a store called Children's Bargain Town. He sold cribs, high chairs, playpens. He used $5,000, half savings and half a bank loan, and ran the entire operation himself. He noticed something within the first year that reordered his entire operation. Parents bought a crib once, but they bought toys again and again and again. Every birthday, every Christmas, every time a child outgrew the last thing. The repeat purchase rate on toys was unlike anything else in the children's market. And the bigger a toy company got, the more valuable its balance sheet became as collateral. So he added a cradle gym. It sold immediately. Then tricycles. Then board games. By the early 1950s, toys had overtaken furniture as the primary revenue source, and Lazarus made a decision that no other retailer in the country had attempted. He would build a store that sold nothing but toys, modeled after a supermarket. Wide aisles, high shelves, massive selection, year-round operation. A standalone destination for children and the parents who could not say no to them. In 1957, he opened that store in Rockville, Maryland. He called it Toys R Us. The R was printed backwards in the logo, as if a small child had written it. Nobody else was doing this. Department stores put toys out in November and pulled them in January. Lazarus stocked them 12 months a year. And that warehouse scale, 20,000 items in a single location, became the physical experience that children carried for the rest of their lives. The ceiling was higher than a grocery store. The shelves ran deeper than a department store. A 7-year-old standing in the action figure aisle for the first time could feel a kind of vertigo. There was simply more than any single person could absorb. Lazarus understood that the experience of abundance was itself the product. The Times Square flagship in Manhattan opened in 2001 with a 60-foot indoor Ferris wheel. But the flagship was not where the company's real power lived. The real power was in the 1,400 other locations, the ones in suburban strip malls next to grocery stores and tire centers, where the building looked like a warehouse from the outside and felt like a kingdom from the inside. Those stores moved 20% of every toy sold in America. Those were the buildings where a parent could hand a child the autumn catalog and say, "Pick 3 things," and the child understood instinctively that 3 things from Toys R Us meant something entirely different from 3 things anywhere else. Every one of those 1,400 leases was a line item that a financial firm could borrow against. By the late 1970s, Toys R Us had locations across the United States. By the early 1980s, it was the largest toy retailer in America. Geoffrey the Giraffe appeared on every shopping bag, every newspaper circular, and every television commercial that aired between Saturday morning cartoons. By 1992, annual sales reached $7.2 billion. Toys R Us in the 90s was not just a store. It was a destination that entire Saturdays were built around. The company expanded internationally to more than 20 countries. At peak, Toys R Us operated roughly 800 stores in the United States and 800 internationally. 1 out of every 5 toys sold in America crossed a Toys R Us register. The demo stations near the entrance let children test products. It was the store where families waited 18 months for a Cabbage Patch Kid and considered it worth every week. The layaway counter allowed families to pay over time. The seasonal catalogs, big books they were called, arrived in mailboxes every fall, and children circled items with a pen the way earlier generations had circled pages in the Sears Wish Book. And that footprint, that enormous physical and financial presence, is exactly what made the company a target. Lazarus stepped down as chief executive in 1994. Walmart surpassed Toys R Us as the largest toy seller by 1998. Sales flattened, the stores felt dated. In 2001, Toys R Us outsourced its entire online retail operation to Amazon in an exclusive partnership. Amazon gained the data. Toys R Us gained nothing that could not be replicated. When the partnership ended in a lawsuit in 2004, Amazon had learned what American parents bought for their children, and Toys R Us had lost 5 years of e-commerce development. But none of this was fatal. Flat sales at $11 billion are not a dying business. It is a slow business. Slow businesses survive if they are allowed to reinvest. Toys R Us was not allowed to reinvest. If you watched the Sears story, you saw what happens when one entity engineers a structure where a company pays rent on buildings it used to own. Saturday mornings at Sears looked a lot like Saturday mornings at Toys R Us. The whole trip was anchored by a store that felt permanent. Sears was drained by one man who controlled both sides of the real estate transaction. Toys R Us was drained by 3 firms that controlled neither side. They did not need to own the buildings. They owned the debt, and the debt was the instrument. On March 17, 2005, Bain Capital, Kohlberg Kravis Roberts, and Vornado Realty Trust announced a definitive agreement to acquire Toys R Us for $26.75 per share, a total transaction value of $6.6 billion. The consortium contributed roughly $1.3 billion in equity. The remaining $5.3 billion was borrowed, and here is the structure that matters. The debt was not placed on the balance sheets of Bain, KKR, or Vornado. It was placed on Toys R Us. The company being purchased was required to borrow the money used to purchase itself. That is not an error in the sentence. That is the mechanism. The acquiring firms committed roughly 20% of the purchase price. The other 80% became a liability of the toy stores, the warehouse floors, the checkout systems, and the 33,000 employees who would eventually lose their jobs without severance. Before the buyout, Toys R Us held $2.2 billion in cash and carried approximately $2.3 billion in debt. After the buyout closed in July 2005, the cash reserves were deployed toward the transaction. The debt climbed above $5.2 billion. The capital structure flipped from 30% debt to 78% debt. The ratio of debt to annual earnings went above 7 times. Every dollar of operating income now faced a competing claim before it could fund store renovations, website upgrades, or employee wages. And that competing claim was $400 million a year. And once you see the payment schedule, you realize the ending was not a possibility. It was calendared. $400 million a year. That was the interest on debt structured by the buyers and placed onto the company's own books. For every $100 a family spent in a Toys R Us store after 2005, a portion of the company's operating income was routed to creditors, who financed a transaction the families walking those aisles never knew had happened. Not to inventory, not to new checkout systems, not to the employees stacking shelves at 7 in the morning, to interest payments on a loan the company took out to buy itself. The sponsors also structured a separate revenue stream for themselves. An advisory agreement established annual fees of roughly $45 million per year across the 3 firms, with a 5% annual escalation clause. They collected these fees regardless of the company's profitability. $81 million in transaction fees were collected at closing, and there were dividend recapitalizations. After loading the initial acquisition debt, the sponsors went back to the credit markets and borrowed additional money against the company's assets. They then paid themselves dividends from that borrowed money before the company had generated any value from the transaction. More debt was added so the owners could receive cash returns. Bankruptcy court filings later documented that the total amount collected by the 3 sponsors in fees, transaction charges, and dividends before Chapter 11 reached $470 million. That is what left the building while the lights were still on. Now, scale. $400 million in annual interest payments. That is the debt, not the business. $470 million in fees and dividends to 3 financial firms. That is what left before the doors closed. 33,000 employees were terminated with 0 severance. Divide the $470 million by the 33,000 jobs, and the result is more than $14,000 per person. Enough to cover a month of rent for the employee locking the doors for the last time. That money was not severance. It was the advisory fee. Some people call that a standard fee structure. Others call it a receipt. The debt did not only drain cash, it froze the company in 2005 while every competitor kept moving. Target redesigned its toy departments. Walmart expanded online fulfillment. Amazon built recommendation algorithms trained partly on purchase data that Toys R Us had helped provide through the failed partnership. Amazon did not kill Toys R Us. Amazon sold toys at lower prices. The $400 million a year in interest payments killed the budget that would have let Toys R Us match those prices. Whether you blame the competition or the contract depends on whether you think a company generating $11 billion in revenue needed saving. And Toys R Us could not renovate a single store format without first satisfying $400 million in annual interest. The capital expenditure line was not cut because management made poor decisions. It was cut because the debt service schedule left no room. 1 year, the company generated more than $150 million in operating profit and could not cover even half of its interest obligations. Here is the part that matters if you were standing under those fluorescent lights in 2007, thinking the store just felt a little tired. The deal was built so the store pays first, not the buyers. The buyers put in a minority slice of cash, then the aisles inherit the rest as a monthly obligation. If the company grows, the sponsors win twice. If it fails, they have already been paid along the way, and the debt is not recourse to them personally. The downside is absorbed by the employees, the suppliers, and the communities where those stores anchored the Saturday morning trip. That is not an accusation. That is the contract. If you ever walked through a Toys R Us after 2005 and noticed the carpet was fraying, or the shelving units had not been updated since the 90s, or the checkout system was slower than a grocery store kiosk, now you understand why. The renovation budget was servicing an interest payment. The technology budget was paying an advisory fee. Those toy aisles, where every box was taller than you were paying $400 million a year in interest. That is what this channel is. Not nostalgia. The paperwork underneath nostalgia. If you want the next autopsy before the next store goes dark, subscribe. Toys R Us was also an anchor tenant. Not in enclosed malls the way Sears or J.C. Penney had been, but in power centers and strip malls across the United States. The stores were often freestanding, but their size and foot traffic anchored smaller retailers nearby. Pet supply stores, sporting goods outlets, family restaurants, all clustered around a Toys R Us because the toy store brought families with disposable income into the parking lot. The leases for those smaller tenants frequently contained co-tenancy clauses tied to the presence of a named anchor. When Toys R Us closed, those clauses activated. Smaller tenants gained the legal right to renegotiate rent or terminate leases entirely. One anchor closure did not remove one store. It destabilized the financial model of the entire retail pad. Landlords faced vacancies they could not fill at the same rate. Tenants who left triggered their own co-tenancy cascades in adjacent properties. It was a chain reaction, and it started with a single lease termination letter from a company carrying $5 billion in debt it did not generate. The parking lot where a 6-year-old once learned to ride the bicycle that came out of that store on Christmas morning is now half empty on a Saturday afternoon. Spirit Halloween moves into the shell for 8 weeks every October. Self-storage companies convert the warehouse floor into climate-controlled units. The co-tenancy cascade does not require a recession. It requires one anchor to close. And when that anchor was carrying $5 billion in acquisition debt, the closure was not a market outcome. It was a contractual one. On September 18, 2017, Toys R Us filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection. The company disclosed more than $5 billion in long-term debt. The filing was intended as a restructuring, not a liquidation. Management planned to borrow additional funds, stock shelves for the holidays, and renegotiate the debt. The supply chain fractured within days. Vendors who had shipped inventory on 30- and 60-day credit terms for decades switched to cash on delivery. Mattel, Hasbro, Lego, every major toy manufacturer had to recalculate its risk exposure to a retailer that still moved 20% of all toys sold in America. A toy store cannot survive a holiday season without inventory, and it cannot get inventory when every supplier is demanding cash it does not have because the cash reserves were drawn down over 12 years of debt service. Before the buyout, the company had $2.2 billion in cash. By the filing, $301 million. The debt had not just consumed income, it had consumed the safety net. The holiday season of 2017 came in below projection. The shelves were thin. Parents walked past sections where the pegboard hooks were empty and the end cap displays held a single row of products instead of 4. The employees knew. Many had worked in those buildings for 10 or 15 years. They could see the gaps widening every week. On March 14, 2018, the company announced the liquidation of all United States operations. Approximately 800 stores, 33,000 employees, no severance payments. Everything must go signs went into the windows within days. Families walked through those aisles one last time, picking through half-empty shelves under fluorescent lights that had not been replaced in years. The signs said, "Everything must go," in the same building where everything once felt possible. 70% off, action figures in open bins, board games with dented corners, the demo stations unplugged, the layaway counter dark. Charles Lazarus was 94 years old. He had started the company 70 years earlier with $5,000 in his father's bicycle shop. He had built a single baby furniture store into the largest toy retailer in the history of the world. He had not been involved in company operations for more than 2 decades. He died on March 22, 2018. Liquidation sales began March 23rd. Geoffrey the Giraffe was retired. The brand name was eventually licensed back into the United States, where it now exists as a small section inside Macy's department stores. If you have been following this series, you already know where the Macy's story leads. Now, the question this channel always reaches: was this a failed bet, or was this a structure designed to collect fees regardless of what happened to the stores? Reading 1. The defense. Toys R Us was losing ground before the buyout. Walmart overtook it as the largest toy seller in 1998, 7 years before the leveraged buyout. Target was gaining share. Amazon was growing its toy category every quarter. The company's own board initiated the strategic review and actively sought buyers. The consortium paid a market price validated by the board and regulators. The firms contributed $1.3 billion of their own capital, all of which they ultimately lost. The advisory fees were contractual, disclosed, and consistent with industry standards. Leveraged buyouts are not inherently destructive. Burger King went through an LBO and emerged stronger. Dollar General went through one and expanded to 18,000 locations. Hilton Hotels went through one and increased its valuation dramatically. This was a bet on a turnaround that did not materialize. Reading 2. The prosecution. The $470 million in fees and dividends meant the sponsors recovered roughly 36% of their equity investment before bankruptcy. The annual debt service consumed the capital expenditure budget needed to compete with Amazon, Target, and Walmart. The company generated $11.6 billion in annual revenue at acquisition and still held 20% of the market at bankruptcy. Its net losses in the final years were consistently smaller than its debt service payments. In 2017, the company lost $36 million. Its interest payments exceeded $400 million. Without the buyout debt, the company would have reported an operating profit. The debt made it terminal. The fee structure ensured the sponsors collected revenue regardless of survival. Employees received no severance. Those sponsors had already collected $470 million. Both readings use the same numbers. Both cite the same public filings. The difference is intent. Whether the debt was a genuine turnaround instrument that failed, or a fee collection structure that operated precisely as designed, comes down to one question. When the firms structured the transaction to collect $470 million from a company carrying $5 billion in acquisition debt, did they genuinely believe the stores would survive? Or did they build a contract where it did not matter? If you worked at Toys R Us during the liquidation, you watched that answer play out on the sales floor. Tell me what the last week looked like. The company that invented the toy supermarket carried $400 million a year in interest on a loan designed to buy itself. The firms that arranged the loan collected fees for every year the lights stayed on. Some call that accountability. Others call it a receipt. Toys R Us was the store where a 7-year-old could stand in an aisle and believe the world contained more things than any single person could ever own. That building is now a Spirit Halloween, a self-storage unit, or a vacant lot with faded parking lines. The debt that killed the store was not unusual. The fee structure that drained it was not illegal. The contract that prevented renovation for over a decade was standard practice in private equity. Why Toys R Us failed is not a question of retail competition. It is a document. A $6.6 billion leveraged buyout. $5.3 billion in debt placed on the company. $400 million a year in interest. $470 million in fees collected before bankruptcy. 33,000 jobs eliminated with no severance. Cash reserves drawn from $2.2 billion to $301 million over 12 years. Every number is public. Every contract is on record. If you profit on the way in, collect fees during, and walk away when the building goes dark, is that a failed investment? Or is that a structure that never needed the store to survive? The toy industry did not shrink. Global toy sales grew every year through Toys R Us's decline. The demand walked out of one set of doors and into another: Target, Walmart, Amazon. The building where it used to live is still standing in most towns. The sign is gone. The windows are papered over. The building is still the right size. It is still in the right location. It just has the wrong number on the balance sheet. Now, the next time you walk into a mall and notice that the floor plan makes no sense, that you keep passing the same stores, that the corridors seem designed to prevent you from finding the exit, that is not poor architecture. That is the Gruen transfer. The man who invented it spent the rest of his life trying to warn people about what he had created. If Toys R Us was drained through interest, the American mall was drained through geometry. The architect who designed the modern enclosed shopping mall envisioned a public square. What got built was a machine for extracting rent. He said so himself, and nobody listened. That story is next.